the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
The views and opinions expressed by A Little Bit Culty are those of the hosts and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast.
No, they don't.
Any of the ridiculously thought-provoking content provided by our guests, bloggers, sponsors, or authors are of their opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything. Also, we're not doctors, psychologists, or Her Supreme Holiness Gwyneth Paltrow.
Goop.
We're just two mortals trying to make a gluten-free, holistically helpful podcast that helps, informs, and entertains, and maybe moisturizes. Silky, silky smooth. Hey everybody, Sarah Edmondson here.
And I'm Anthony Ames, a.k.a. Nippy, Sarah's husband, and you're listening to
A Little Bit Culty,
a.k.a. ALBC, a podcast about what happens when devotion goes to the dark side.
We've been there and back again. A little about us. True story, we met and fell in love in a cult. And then we woke up and got the hell out of Dodge.
And the whole thing was captured in the HBO docuseries The Vow, now in its second season.
I also wrote about our experience in my memoir, Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life.
Look at us, a couple of married podcasters who just happen to have a weekly date night where we interview experts and advocates in things like cult awareness and mind control.
Wait. This does not count toward date night, babe. We got to schedule that. That's separate.
So it's 2 days we got to hang out?
We do this podcast thing because we learned a lot on our exit ramp out of NXIVM. Still on that journey, and we want to pay the lessons forward with the help of other cult survivors and whistleblowers.
We know all too well that culty things happen. It happens to people every day across every walk of life. So join us each week to tackle these culty dynamics, everywhere from online dating to mega churches and multi-level marketing.
This stuff really is everywhere. The cultiverse just keeps on expanding, and so are we. Welcome to Season 5 of A Little Bit Culty, serving cult content and word salads weekly on your favorite podcast platforms. Learn more at alittlebitculty.com.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, hanging on to it, my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We have another heavy hitter for you today. Our guest grew up in the Children of God, a religious cult founded by her grandfather in 1968. Word to the wise, Children of God was later renamed The Family in a failed attempt to rehab their public image. But there's no sanitizing this shit. This is one of the most disturbing cults we've ever researched for this podcast.
So please be warned that this episode delves into themes related to the darkest aspects of a truly notorious cult, including child abuse, sexual assault, incest, and other horrifying and triggering topics. And please, culty listeners, we care about you, so listen safely and see our resource pages at alittlebitculty.com for links to free resources if you or someone you know needs support.
But also, just know that on the other side of the hardest chapters in our guest story, there's some pretty incredible light ahead. She's a force, and she's got some pretty powerful wisdom to share about how to get through some unimaginable shit. And she's doing more than surviving. She's truly thriving. So there's a disclaimer, but also a disclaimer to our disclaimer.
So let's get started. Let's tell you a little about her before we get right into the interview.
Faith Jones is the author of Sex Cult Nun, her disturbing, infuriating, heartbreaking, and also really fucking inspiring memoir of growing up in the Children of God, leaving it, and her journey to taking back her life after severe childhood trauma.
And taking it back she has. An accomplished lawyer, activist, entrepreneur, and business advisor, she began her career as an attorney representing clients in a wide variety of cross-border corporate transactions and has worked with businesses and government leaders in the Pacific Rim.
She's also been a featured TEDx speaker and has traveled the world doing humanitarian work in Kazakhstan, Russia, Japan, and Taiwan. She's made of some gritty and impressive stuff. Her bio alone is giving me international super spy vibes. It's pretty rad.
And if you want to hear us unpack this interview after this episode, be sure to head over to Patreon for our post-Faith Jones mini-sode. And without any further ado, here's our chat with Faith Jones.
Welcome, Faith. Welcome to A Little Bit Culty.
Thank you for having me.
I have to tell you that ever since your book came out, I've been following you on Instagram and watching this incredible journey. And I'm so excited that we finally get to have you on the show and ask all the questions about your upbringing and your wild journey. So thanks for taking the time.
The first thing that I wanted to say to you is it's very impressive because it's so important that people come out and are brave to take these things down, because what allows them to exist is people don't say anything. And with any abuses of power, normally it's cowardice at the top that allows it to persist. And what you're doing is necessary for the human team and appreciated definitely by Sarah and I, and I'm sure everyone else who's been through something like that, to give them the bravery to address what you're addressing in the way that you're doing it. So it was very impressive to hear your story and watch you go through your journey, and appreciate it.
Thank you, Nippy. And thank you too for all you're doing with putting this podcast out there and raising awareness around some of these issues of control and abuse, which I think is so important to understand that they exist everywhere, and some more aggressively than others. So I think it's great that you're doing this to raise this awareness and help give people red flags to look for, whether it's in an actual cult or in a bad relationship. I mean, these really ultimately are bad relationships of power, manipulation, and control.
Yeah, that's been the lane I think our podcast has found, and that people have gravitated towards us, is that the abuses of power that go on inside the systems that we were in go on everywhere, and spotting them is essential to not let them win.
Yes. And I appreciate that you also do it with humor, because I am a
Yeah,
big
we try.
proponent of,
Yeah, we tap
being
dance with
able
that
to see
line.
the funny side of all
Yeah.
of this craziness. And I think it helps keep you sane to be able to
Yeah,
laugh
it
at
does.
the ridiculousness
Yeah,
of
my
stuff.
mind's always worked that way, so I've kind of
It's partly why we're together, I think.
Yeah.
So we know your story, and I think most of our audience who's either cult obsessed or cult show obsessed like we are, has a basic understanding of Children of God or the Family International. But for anyone who doesn't, would you just lay a little foundation for the audience of your family history and what came before you?
Yeah, so I do a not so brief history of the family in the first chapter of my book.
And that was so helpful, by the way. That was
Thank
so
you.
great. I highly recommend the book, and I'll be talking about the book a lot.
And so the group was founded by my family, actually, my grandfather, my father, his siblings. And my grandfather came from a long line of evangelists, preachers, and he wasn't very successful as one, put it that way. His doctrines were not really being accepted by the church. At that time, he was advocating dropping out, and this was in the 1960s. And, so he had really felt like a failure, I guess. And then they went to Huntington Beach in the late 60s, and his kids got out, who were teenagers at the time, and started witnessing or preaching about Jesus to the hippies, the young people. So all of these young people that had basically dropped out of the system, as we called it, right? And left home, who are also teenagers themselves, and were living this life as hippies, bums on the beach or in these communes. And they were preaching a message of, Jesus, salvation, the end time, serving God, and really making the world a better place. It actually started to be quite big among the churches. It was the start of the Jesus People movement. My grandfather had spent a short time in the military before he washed out due to health issues. And so they had a very strict, hierarchical, rigid, obedience schedule. They were memorizing hundreds of verses a day. They were sleeping on the floor and washing dishes and out all hours, witnessing. And it was this very militant kind of a style. But the beliefs were not much different than the churches of the day. There was no sex before marriage. You couldn't even hold hands with some of the opposite sex. It was just more this sacrificing everything, living like the early church. When you joined, you gave up all of your possessions, although, that was pretty easy for the hippies. They had a backpack, right? So, it wasn't that big a deal for them. And then they had this family, and they were, love bombed. They were welcomed with all of this love and, we're your true family and everything like that. So it was very appealing. And when my mother joined, it was still in the early days, and she was probably 20, 21. I mean, she left home as a teenager, became a hippie, and danced on Broadway. She was very idealistic. She was about to fly to India to join an ashram to,
find herself in spiritual. And when her best girlfriend called her up and she joined this Jesus People house. And it was just a commune. And, when my mother, she like got saved and accepted Jesus, and she had a cigarette habit. She smoked a pack a day. And she used to always tell us, the instant she got saved, she threw those cigarettes in the trash and never, had a desire to smoke again. God just healed her instantly of her nicotine, addiction and everything. And this was the typical story from these young people. So it was, the people were very idealistic, hardworking, and smart. They weren't dumb. Like my mother had, was very smart in school. She just quit, because she wanted to be a hippie and had all these ideals.
Do you happen to know which ashram she almost went to in India?
She tried to join the one that's in California, the yogi. He wrote Autobiography of a Yogi.
Oh, like the Kundalini yogi, I think? Yogi
No.
Bhajan?
Yeah, she tried to join that one. So then what happened was they began to gather hundreds of followers. People were like moving in with them, right? As they began to grow, they took these buses across America and were preaching. And then they all ended up at this, it was a previous, like a witnessing school for church, a ranch in Texas. And that's where they, kind of consolidated and grew. And my mother ended up there too. And then from that point, this was a few years in the early 70s, like 70, 71. By that point, they had started to get some bad publicity, right? At first, it was good publicity. Here, this is great, getting these dirty hippies off of drugs and preaching Jesus. And right. So they were praised for that. But then there began to be like parents were getting really concerned. They're really concerned about their kids, and their kids would come home just spouting scriptures and not able to say anything else, basically, and they were starting to get worried that this was a cult and that had parents start to go after them. And then there was, I think there was a lawsuit in New York about financial something or other. So my grandfather felt like, the devil is after us and he's gonna disappear. So he left and went to England. And so began this huge movement to spread all over the world. So he began writing all these letters. So at first he was there physically teaching daily classes for hours with all these kids. And then when he left, he began to communicate via letter, right? So, but before he left, he had gotten together with a young woman who joined the group, her name was Karen Zerby. She changed it to Maria. So when anybody joined the group, they changed their name and took a Bible name to show that they were born again and a new person, in Christ Jesus. And this was their true family. And he had actually, so this woman, Karen Zerby, who took the name Maria, became his secretary. And unknown to most of the people, became his lover. He was married at the time, right? He was still married to the woman who came to be called Mother Eve, who was my grandmother. So I kind of explain how this went down. His mother, who he respected greatly, Virginia, was a preacher all over. And after she passed, I think it really gave him that leeway he needed to start going off in his own direction with the doctrines. So then he got this doctrine about, one wife, that the wife of one is the wife of everyone. And then began this path of the law of love, where, using one verse in the Bible or two verses in the Bible, twisting them against everything else said in the Bible about it. He got the revelation that basically anything done in love is good with God. And everything you do in love, including sharing sexually outside your marriage with other members of the group or with other people who need love, quote unquote, right? This is all good and blessed by God. You're doing it for Jesus, etc.
So you could just manipulate it into the definition of that was done in love, and there's plausible deniability, in essence.
Yes.
Wow.
For those who don't know, this is like the foundational belief under the sort of doctrine of children of God, that God is love, love is sex, sex is God. Is that accurate?
No, not sex is God, but sex is approved by God, that is blessed, that is a good thing, that is your duty to others. So then it began to be twisted with, the verse in the Bible which says, if a man hunger, give him some food. If he needs your cloak, give him your cloak, et cetera, et cetera. Like take care of a person's physical needs to show them love and to show them God's care. Well, my grandfather decided that, especially for men, sex was a fundamental physical need. So therefore, you needed to take care of that physical need for men before they were able to focus on the Bible, right? And then that turned into the doctrine of flirty fishing. So in the early days, like when my mother joined, there was already the seeds of control there. Like she was actually told to marry somebody that she had just met, she didn't know. And they were marrying people, pairing them up so that they could send them out to different locations to send them overseas. They had to get married. And so these kids were being told who to marry. And they didn't even know them, the person. And so my mother tells me a few weeks as soon as they got married, she realized it was a big mistake. It took her a few months to manage to get out of it, but she ended up getting herself sent off somewhere else as a pioneer. So, she didn't have to keep going with the marriage. But, the control and the manipulation was there from the very beginning. It was just how they were taking it, like how it was being twisted. And so when my grandfather wanted to get together with this woman, Maria, he had created the doctrine of the law of love, got this revelation, etc. And it just kind of kept building from there, right? So they went to England, and then Maria they started going to nightclubs in England. Maria was dancing with different men there, flirting with them, etc., bringing them to my grandfather to talk to. And this began, and then they got this very wealthy man, Arthur. In the letters, he's called King Arthur, right? Because they, made it the same as like Queen Esther marrying the king and so on, right? So they had all of these things that they could pull from, of course, totally twisting the stories and the verses and the interpretation and the meaning of it. But these people really believed in this, like 100% fundamentally. So, that began the doctrine of flirty fishing, which is really, I think, what the family became known for. And that began to get the family in the papers because they were sending the women out, and these are young women, to have sex with men outside the group in order to recruit them, to flirt with, dance, have sex with men to recruit them either into the group or more often to recruit them to help support the group with donations, because nobody in the group could have a job because that was working for mammon, right? And you can't serve God and mammon. So they had to be 100% committed to missionary work.
Missionary work. So it's either being committed to the family, or I love the word that you use a lot throughout your book, the systemites.
Yes.
Anyone in the outside world or part of the system is you're a systemite, which is such a, clear example of the us versus them.
Yes.
Framework and all the cults we've looked at. I've also, as you've heard in our podcast, we always ask people what hooked you, what brought you in, what did you think you were signing up for? And obviously that wasn't the case for you because you were born into it. But it sounds like, or maybe you could say in your own words, what your parents thought they were buying into in terms of saving the world and being workers for Jesus. Was that pitted against the end times that was quickly encroaching, or what was the vision that they thought they were getting?
Yeah. So there was definitely the message of the end time, that the Antichrist is coming and Jesus is coming back. There's definitely that message that gave an immediacy and urgency to everything. And that got more urgent as time went on, actually. Initially, it was more about love and family. And I think what a lot of cults do, they offer you this love and this family and this purpose, this great humanitarian purpose. And you're the special ones, and you're the chosen, and, you're the elite end time army for God, this kind of thing, right? And a lot of these kids, they didn't fit in with their families. And, in the 1960s, it was a very idealistic time.
Also, communal living in the 70s was, I still kind of want to live that way.
They were ready for that, right?
Yeah.
He had been trying to preach to the communal living, like live like the early church in Acts, and which, he takes from this verse, all that believed lived together and had all things common. So he was trying to preach at the churches, and they were not having it, but he preached it to the hippies. Well, they were already living communally. So,
right.
That was easy. It was an easy target market. And, they'd already kind of dropped out. They'd already kind of given up everything. They'd often left home, left their families, right? So
the system was already vilified.
Yes. So
right?
he was very anti the man. It was the Vietnam War. There was all of this going on. It was kind of the perfect kind of cultural storm for this to grow.
Similar to now a little bit.
And it ended up growing to be over, 10,000 members worldwide, all over countries all over the world. So, he preached the, destruction of America, and America is Babylon the whore, and get out, because to try to get these guys to go to all these very poor foreign countries, India, Brazil, China, everywhere. So these kids began to go, and the goal and the vision was to preach to as many people as you could before the end came, right? Before Jesus came back and the Antichrist and everything. So that was really, what they were signing up for. And to be honest, there was a lot of good elements in the fact that, like, communal living done,
I love it.
in the way everyone, mothers had help with the kids. They had their own little kids groups that the kids would go to. People took turns cooking, so you didn't have to cook every time. It's much harder to do all that stuff yourself. Take care of the
Right.
kids, cook all the meals, do all the cleaning, right? In
Oh,
this
we
case,
know.
all of the jobs are divvied up. And everyone gets up in the morning and they have their devotions, and then they have their job for that day. It might be cleaning the toilets, or it might be cooking lunch, or it might be taking care of the 3-year-olds or the 6-year-olds or whatever, right? And everyone goes and does that job. And the people who are doing those jobs aren't really worrying about the money so much. Everybody would have to go out and do witnessing as well, but there was a finance man and he took charge of the money. And then there were people who were better at going out and raising money and getting donations, so they would be doing that more. And someone who was better with the kids would stay with the kids, you see? And so when you're happy in that scenario and you're living in that scenario, it takes care of a lot of the concerns and worries and stress that we have in our lives. But at the same time, and if you're in charge, that's great, right? But at the same time, you're subjected to all of the control that goes along with that type of a group and that society, right? And then you had not only the control, like, so people were living together communally, like my family lived with a few other families who, they got on well. But then as it began to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, our life at the farm, and more people came, and there had more interference, I guess, from the outside hierarchical, higher up leadership. And, just things changed over time. And one thing within like a group like this is there was constant swings, right? There was these huge pendulum swings. Like for a few years, it would all be like this, go out and, even with FFing. After about 10 years of FFing, and you like had to go out and FF. If you were
Flirty fish, for those who don't remember.
sorry, flirty fishing.
Yeah.
The women had to go out and recruit men like with sex. If you didn't, you were unyielded to God, and girl who wouldn't, all this sort of stuff. And then all of a sudden, total ban on it. So like in the mid 80s, late 80s, when AIDS came out, right, and that began to be a bigger thing because everybody had sex with each other within the group, then they totally banned any outside contact with outsiders, right? So women who'd had relationships with these men for 5-7 years, they had to cut them off, and sometimes had children with them. And then, there would be one move that everybody go out and pioneer, and you don't have to live in a home of a certain size. And then all of a sudden, a few years later, it swings back. If you're not in a home with more than 20 people, you're excommunicated, So this constant going back and forth is another tactic of control because it keeps you on edge all the time. You didn't know what was coming, what new revelation from God, I'm doing quotes here, was coming that was going to like just totally upend your life and throw you in a different direction. First you got to go pioneer this country, and then you're supposed to be pioneering that country, and then it's the other country, and then it's get out of this, right? So it's exciting, right? I think when you're young and stuff, that can be very exciting to have this constant life on the edge, but it's also very manipulative. You can never get complacent. You don't really have time to think. You're constantly adjusting.
This is the golden age of cult recovery. The more we speak up and share our stories, the more we realize we are not alone. Your voice and your story can empower others. This is Sarah, and I'm proud to be a founding collaborator of the #IGotOut movement. Learn more at igotout.org. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or never miss yoga. Maybe it's getting 8 hours of sleep. I mean, that's my personal and everyone's dream, isn't it? Well, I definitely have some non-negotiables. Like I'm in Vancouver right now, and I'm spending literally as much time as I can outside in nature. #cold pools, #crushing it. Nature is a non-negotiable. Not enough time in the fresh air and the trees around me, and I start to feel not great, not myself, not grounded. Therapy day is a bit like my nature walks. I try to not miss it, and I know I'm just going to feel so much better all around if I make it a priority. I get so much out of it. It helps me put my worries and anxieties in their rightful place and helps me clear my mind so I can focus on what I really need and sometimes what I don't need. Like, I don't need to be overbooking myself just because I hate to say no to people. You know what I mean? Thanks, therapy. Thanks for helping me see that. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, Give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist. And switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Look, even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/culty today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/culty.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
You know what? One thing I really loved about your book is that you really brought us into the mind, your internal mind as a child. And I really felt like you expressed something that I think a lot of people don't get unless they've been through something like this, which is that how do you justify it? Like, how do you go along with it? How do you not say like, fuck off, I'm not going to have sex with that person, or I'm not going to move across the country, or, follow order? How do you stay a sheep, which is even a term used in both of our cults? So that you brought us into the mind of the compliance and basically justifying everything on one assumption. And that assumption is that your grandfather, David Moses, was a prophet and had a direct line to God. Therefore, everything that came through him, through the Mo letters, right? Through the letters, that was the way of communicating to the communities. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
So every directive through the Mo letters was God's word. And I think that that's something that's so important for people to understand who haven't been in a cult, or, maybe to understand their own upbringing if they were in a cult, is that it's all based on an assumption or a belief. And ironically, Keith actually taught us this in Nexium, that something is only true for somebody down to the base assumption. And the base assumption for your community was that is the word of God. And if you even contest it or question it, then you're not yielding, and Jesus is not in your hearts, and you have to be reformed or punished.
Doubter.
You're a doubter,
You're
right?
a doubter,
The
right?
whole system was set up from the beginning to control, to keep you a sheep, to keep you obedient.
I would say that there were two base assumptions. There was, probably more than that, but I think there's two fundamental ones. One, yes, is that my grandfather, Moses David, as he was called, was God's mouthpiece, was God's prophet, right? And you always have to put legs under a belief. And the strength of that belief depends on how strong those legs are. So, references to different people from the church getting prophecies over him, that he was the David of the end, the David prophesied that was to come, and so on and so forth. And of course, creating his own myth and legend around all of that. So, and that was built up to support that claim, right? Of course, he didn't claim it initially. It was told to him in Revelation. Right? And then the second base assumption, that when I left the group, there were some deep questions I had, because I could see that some of this stuff was good. I mean, there's a lot of really wonderful Bible verses, and people living in, share to show love, not just the sexual kind, but actually caring for their brothers and sisters in the group, and, helping each other out.
Some good ways to
if you're
live.
sick, there was always somebody there to help take care of you, to take care of your kids, all of this kind of stuff. And, this very strong idealism of, wanting to help others. And we did lots of, kind of volunteer work stuff, helping in orphanages and distributing food in Russia. And, there's a lot of this stuff that people really believed in, and I believed in. So my question was, how do you have that and then have such abuse, right? Some of the abuse we didn't get into was not just the, initial abuse of women being forced to flirty fish or to share with men outside their marriage. But there was also came to be sexual abuse of children, because that was considered, and I describe my own experiences in the book from my perspective as a child, because I think it's so important to share with people, like you said, how do you see it when you're in the group? It's very different. And when I left the group, I love to read novels. I talk about my very first novel in the book that I found when I was, 10 years old. It was The Secret Garden, and I was just hooked, but we weren't allowed to read outside books. And I wanted to bring that to the reader in a different way, in a more immediate way, the story, not with this, I'm looking back and I'm telling my story, with hindsight of years and judgments and all kinds of stuff. I wanted to take people into that moment, what it felt like to be that little kid walking through those different things and growing up and having my realizations change. I think that was probably one of the hardest things in writing the book, was because I literally had to time travel back. I had to put myself back in my body at those ages. What did I believe? What did I smell? What did I see? What was all around me? What were my thoughts?
Was that traumatic or cathartic? Or
That
both?
was very difficult to do in some cases for some of those experiences. But ultimately, I thought that was really important for the reader to go on that journey with me and not just be told about it later.
Yeah, well, that's where the wisdom comes from.
Just to let them see how might that have been for them too, not just, the hindsight thing.
I have to plug the book here for a minute because I felt like I said earlier, in terms of bringing people along into the thought process, you also shared a couple of key moments where I think that people will definitely be able to relate if they were in a cult or not. Just even the example of your brothers bringing you out to cliff jump, and how, every part of your body was saying, don't do it. This is not safe. You could actually die. Right. And then the other part of you in your mind going like, but this is what I need to do to belong and to be part of this group and to be cool. And I think it's almost like cults have this is the hit I got in that part of your book. It's like cults use the natural problems that are like the underpinnings of peer pressure, like
And competitiveness.
Yeah. And all those things. So I think that people, at least for me, and also obviously with my own experience of the branding, of like my inner dialogue of what I had to tell myself to go through with it, to get it over with, and then also feeling how proud you were that you finally did it, and your dad looking at you lovingly, like you did this really dangerous thing, and what that meant to you, and how that you then use that experience to propel you through all sorts of horrendous things that your body was saying no to, but you were able to justify why you should do those things under, again, the assumptions that it's good and for God and part of love. And I think that's a real service to people who don't understand how these things happen and the slow progressions. Hey there, listener. Hope you're enjoying this episode and that you're remembering to hydrate, stretch, and unclench your jaws. Sometimes listening to conversations about heavy topics can really make you tighten up, And remember, a little bit culty loves you. Also, come hang out with us on Patreon after you finish this episode. It's fun over there. Fun is good. And now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or never miss yoga. Maybe it's getting 8 hours of sleep. I mean, that's my personal and everyone's dream, isn't it? Well, I definitely have some non-negotiables. Like, I'm in Vancouver right now and I'm spending literally as much time as I can outside in nature. Hashtag cold pools, hashtag crushing it. Nature is a non-negotiable. Not enough time in the fresh air and the trees around me, and I start to feel not great, not myself, not grounded. Therapy day is a bit like my nature walks. I try to not miss it, and I know I'm just going to feel so much better all around if I make it a priority. I get so much out of it. It helps me put my worries and anxieties in their rightful place and helps me clear my mind so I can focus on what I really need and sometimes what I don't need. Like, I don't need to be overbooking myself just because I hate to say no to people. You know what I mean? Thanks, therapy. Thanks for helping me see that. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Look, even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/culty today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/culty.
And the other fundamental assumption, which I really dig into more at the end of the book, was my realization that, like, how did this happen? How did people get so far off track, right? And it came from a core fundamental belief that they did not own themselves. And that was preached very heavily in the group, using the verse, for you are bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body and your spirit, which are God's. That, you don't belong to yourself. And that verse, if you really look back at the historical meaning and all of this sort of stuff, it was really talking to people in that time period about not selling themselves into slavery, because people would do that to pay off a debt or something, right? I was saying, don't sell yourself into slavery because, you're already serving God and you need to be able to live according to these morals, not being told what to do by a master. But of course, in the family, they took that to mean, you don't own yourself. You have no rights over your own body. You're supposed to do whatever God tells you to do, quote unquote, which of course is the leadership. The voice of God is the leadership, is grandpa, and then all of the leaders under him. And so when you have this sense that you don't own yourself, that's how people can engage in and justify these terrible abuses. Well, I don't have the right to say no. I don't have the right to say no because God wants me to do this with my body. I don't own it, right? That was such an underlying belief and just fed constantly in the Mo letters. And when I left, it took me a long time to pick that apart. When I finally really got it, I created the framework, and I talk about this on my TEDx talk. And that just clarified for me all the different abuses that we suffer, even in society, crimes, all of it. It all fits within these kind of 4 or 5 rings that describe, like, what are our true rights as humans? What are our human rights? What are the violations against those rights, right? And it begins with that core belief, that core concept of self-ownership. I own myself, therefore I get to choose what I do with my body. And you don't have the right to tell me to give up my time, my sex, my money, whatever that is. This needs to be, and you can't tell me, you can't pressure me into doing it by saying you don't really own it, or all of these other manipulative tactics. And we can talk about those. I'm sure you've talked about them before, but they are much more powerful when used in conjunction with this concept that you don't have self-ownership.
Mm-hmm. So our general format with survivors is, how did you get in and what were the red flags along the way? So, and your book describes some of these key moments with delicious detail. It's incredibly well written. Knowing what you know now and with all the self-education you've done, can you share 1 or 2 moments that you had as a kid or a teenager that were massive red flags, but you didn't know them at the time?
I think every chapter has a massive red flag. I mean, you think about it, just like how my parents got in, this control of your life, telling you who to marry, the sexual abuse I experienced as a child, the over-sexualization of children, taught as a healthy sex without, shame around it, right? And that's true. Kids should be taught that their bodies are beautiful and that there's, nothing shameful about sex, but it should be done privately and at the right age and all of this sort of stuff, right?
Things really got conflated.
Yeah, they really went off the deep end.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there were some court cases and other stuff happened, and people began to see the bad fruits of it as these kids were growing up into teenagers. So then they banned it, right? So there's always, like I said, this back and forth within the group. But definitely huge red flags are manipulation and control. When people are telling you this is what you need to do, believe, this is how you have to live. And if you feel uncomfortable with it, and then they tell you, well, that's just your problem, you're not yielded enough to God, anything that's telling you you don't own yourself, right? That the group gets to tell you what to do with your own body. We see that in our political sphere right now, right? So, it's anything like that. That is a huge red flag of manipulation and control. And then, of course, there's all the typical cult sort of things, right? You have this one leader and, everything they do is God's will and they are the voice of God kind of thing versus, well, let's go study it out and see what it really says. And let's try to study it without a illusion, without a veil of we want it to mean this. So we're going to study it with that goal to interpret it in this way, right? Because we read and studied the Bible every day, but it was when I go back now and read it, I'm like, wow, that interpretation was so far removed from like the whole context that's there, you see? So it's just picking out little pieces and then interpreting them to fit the agenda of the leadership. Right. And of course, it's hard to see this. I mean, it's often young people that join and, they're searching and they're really kind of blind to a lot of this stuff. So what I try to say is, when you're really looking at the framework I created, ask yourself if anything that group is doing is violating those principles. Anything they're teaching is violating those principles. The principle of, self-ownership and self-determination. Are they trying to tell you that what you create is not yours, that it belongs to the group? Are they I show like, what are the 5 elements of a deal and where manipulation and all these things come in, and going through it. And I go through it at the end, especially about how children can't consent. They can't consent to sexual interaction because of the 5 elements that are required to have a valid deal. 2 of those elements are missing, right? Kids can't consent because they do not have the mental capacity to create a contract, which is any kind of exchange, right? Any exchange, sexual exchange. They don't have the capacity to know what they're doing, to know how it's going to affect them later in their life. They simply don't have the mental capacity, which is why we don't allow children to enter into contracts, right? And then the second is undue pressure. And this exists everywhere. I mean, we see it at all points throughout the group, like when mother is afraid of losing her children, which is a very common one.
The thing that kept popping up for me was just the gaslighting constantly of any time that you expressed that you weren't okay with something. And that's something that really stuck out to me, is that you did express yourself as a kid and you said, this isn't right at certain times, and tried to put up, become the ice queen and freeze guys out to protect yourself. And then you were met with this gaslighting of basically any time that you didn't submit, you weren't being loving, which means you weren't doing what God wanted. So I just like that particular gaslighting especially with the adult men and the young children, of like, if you didn't submit, that you weren't being loved. Like, that was the worst thing, to not be loving, because then you weren't with God and you weren't yielding. And that's just thought that was such a gross twist to what love really is.
I think you're absolutely right. That's one of the huge red flags, is that when you're expressing something that is uncomfortable for you to be told, well, you're not right. You're not right to feel that. That shows that you are unloving, lacking, unyielded to God. That's a big red flag. And I think it's done in all of these kind of groups. And I'd say, of course, there's the obvious ones, like the sexual stuff and child sex. And there's obvious stuff like that should be massive red flags to people. But the other aspect is, and this is one of the reasons I created the framework, I wanted to give a clear, objective, logical standard that people could compare their experiences to, their life to, whether it's a bad manipulative, marriage or relationship or a cult, and say, are people violating these principles in this group, right? Because we didn't have an objective standard in the family, in the group. It was just whatever, my grandfather said, the prophet, right? It was whatever he said was God's truth. And we didn't really have an objective standard we were supposed to be comparing it to the Bible, but of course that was just twisted beyond all recognition as well. So when I say is we need, just as a society, a clear objective standard, and that's really what I created. None of these are new principles, right? So it begins with the principle of self-ownership. If someone's trying to tell you you don't own yourself and you don't get to make that free choice about what feels comfortable for you to do with your body, big red flag right off the bat, right? If they're trying to push themselves into your space and you don't feel comfortable with it, whether it's to touch you physically or to try to control what you're doing, big red flag. The next layer is, if I own myself, then I own my creations. I own what I create and I get to choose what I'm going to do with those things. Another thing they told us in the family, you don't own anything.
Is there anything about the group that you want our audience to know that you feel like gets misunderstood, or like anything that you want to share about the group itself before we get into your exit and your healing?
One of the main things that people maybe misunderstand about the group is when they read just sort of the abusive stuff, or they hear about it on documentaries or interviews, they're like, well, why would anybody join that? And it really doesn't talk enough about why people joined in the first place, and sort of the I hesitate to say like the good stuff, right? But I think it's really important for people to be aware of that stuff, because otherwise it's so easy to say, oh, well, this group I've found, they're not abusive at all. They're not a cult. They would never do that. They're so loving and they're so full of, God and inspiration and our idealism of what we're doing in the world, and totally miss the aspects of manipulation and control and sort of the subtle beginning of taking away your personal power. So I think it's important for people to understand that this group was very inspirational. I mean, it was, singing inspirational songs and dancing and jumping around. And, everybody was supposed to be loving to each other and helping each other and taking care of each other. And there were a lot of good people in the group who really tried to live these ideals of, Jesus's love and sacrifice. And then there were, I guess you could say, like really perpetual abusers. Like there were definitely like pedophiles who were in the group. And then there were the people who went along with the policies for as long as those policies were in place, because they felt like they needed to be yielded or submissive to God, but it wasn't their inclination or their choice necessarily, right? So I think it's important to understand you have all these different types of people that would join a group like this, and smart people. A lot of these kids, some of them dropped out of college. They often came from good families. The cults actually really target people that are good-natured, idealistic, hardworking. That's the kind of people that they self-sacrificing, right? And then they get caught up in this thing and deceived. And the longer you're in it and the more you're isolated from everybody else, and the more they have this us and them, and it works on your mind. It's a brainwashing. It works on your mind. It changes your perspective of what the world is. And it changes your worldview. So you act from a totally different place, totally different worldview. And it can happen to anybody, I mean, there may be some people that are like super rebellious and, really strong-willed but you'd be surprised the kind of people that end up in these groups. And I think it's important to realize that. It's important to realize that, yes, it could happen to you. It could happen to your kid. And that's why it's so important to understand these principles that I laid out in the framework of what is really our true, I guess, rights and responsibilities and principles that we should make sure we don't violate and that our leaders don't violate, right? And if you are following somebody, check their life to make sure they're not violating these principles. And if they are, that should bring out some really big questions for you.
So that was our long-awaited chat with Faith Jones. What did you think?
I think we're going to have one of our post-interview walks.
And then a post-interview walk Patreon chat and go a little deeper. I really want to compare more about what I saw in Children of God and how it related to what Keith did.
So let us know what you think about this episode once you've walked it off. Be sure to hit us up over at Instagram or leave us a voicemail on our website at alittlebitculty.com.
And as always, know that anything you say or do in our voicemail might be played on this podcast very soon.
If you're lucky, yeah. We'll be back here soon with a new episode, but in the meantime, you can join us over on Patreon for more discussion about Faith Jones and the Children of God, plus other bonus content.
And you can listen to our new episodes ad-free.
Except I will definitely be plugging Faith's book, Sex, Cult, None.
That's an endorsement, not an ad. Totally fine.
There you go. Thanks, everybody.
Check it out.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean. I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Hope you liked this episode. Let's keep the conversation going and come hang out with us on Patreon, where we keep the tape rolling each week with special episodes just for Patreon subscribers and where we get deep into the weeds of unpacking every episode of The Vow.
And if you're looking for our show notes or some sweet, sweet swag or official ALBC podcast merch or a list of our most recommended cult recovery resources, visit our website at alittlebitculty.com.
And for more background on what brought us here, check out Sarah's page-turning memoir. It's called Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life. It's available on Amazon, Audible, narrated by my wife, and at most bookstores.
A Little Bit Culty is a Talkhouse podcast and a Trace 120 production. We're executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, with writing, research, and additional production support by senior producer Jess Tardy. We're edited, mixed, and mastered by our rocking producer Will Rutherford of Citizens of Sound, and our amazing theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant and co-written by Nigel Asselin. Thank you for listening.